December 22nd, 1944. Private First Class Leo Palmer peered out from his icy foxhole near Bastogne, Belgium, and saw something that defied logic. 4 German soldiers were advancing toward American positions, carrying a large white flag of truce. One officer had a briefcase tucked under his arm. They moved slowly through the snow, passing bewildered American troops who raised their weapons but held their fire. Palmer, a Browning automatic rifle gunner with the 101st Airborne Division, watched in puzzlement as the German party drew closer. Behind him, 14,000 American soldiers crouched in foxholes and improvised defensive lines, surrounded on every side by German forces. They had been under siege for 2 days, enduring armored assaults, artillery barrages, and temperatures that plummeted below freezing each night. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson shouted a challenge to the Germans. They replied that they carried an urgent message for the American commander. After being blindfolded, the 2 German officers left their enlisted men behind and were escorted to a command post. Word spread swiftly along the American perimeter. Rumors raced through the trenches that the Germans were surrendering, that they'd finally had enough, that the blockade was ending. But those whispers were tragically false. What those officers carried in that briefcase would compel the American commander to make a historic decision, one that would resonate through military history. His reply, just a single word, would become the most famous answer ever delivered to an enemy's surrender demand. The stand that followed would be remembered as one of the finest displays of American bravery in the Second World War. To understand how 14,000 U.S. soldiers found themselves encircled in a Belgian town in December 1944, fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, we must go back 2 weeks to December 16th. That morning, over 200,000 German troops launched Adolf Hitler's final, desperate gamble to reverse the course of the war. By late 1944, Germany was crumbling. Allied forces had liberated France, crossed into Belgium, and were preparing the final push into Germany. In the east, the Soviets were crushing Nazi armies relentlessly. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was disintegrating, and everyone knew it. Everyone except Hitler. The German Führer conceived one last audacious scheme. He would concentrate his remaining armored divisions, break through the Allied lines in the Ardennes forest, and push northwest toward the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in half. It was the same tactic that had succeeded brilliantly in 1940, when German panzers swept through the Ardennes and conquered France in 6 weeks. Hitler believed that capturing Antwerp and separating the British from the Americans might force the Western Allies to negotiate, allowing Germany to focus all strength against the Soviet Union. It was a reckless plan, driven more by wishful thinking than sound strategy, but Hitler ordered it to proceed regardless. The assault began before dawn on December 16th with a massive artillery bombardment. Then, through the fog and snow, came the tanks. Hundreds of German panzers and infantry divisions smashed into the thinly held American lines across the Ardennes. The EBT sector was defended mostly by inexperienced troops sent there to rest or by battle-worn divisions recovering. From earlier campaigns, many American units, caught completely off guard, broke and fled. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and ran in panic. Roads were choked with retreating men and discarded equipment. In the Schnee-Eifel sector, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, about 6,500 men, were surrounded and forced to surrender. It was one of the largest capitulations of American troops in the entire war. The German advance created a massive bulge in the Allied front lines, giving the conflict its name, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces drove deep into Belgium, advancing up to 50 miles in some sectors. Hitler's gamble seemed to be working. The Allied command structure was thrown into disarray, as officers struggled to grasp the scale and direction of the German assault. At the center of the German push lay a small Belgian town called Bastogne, an unremarkable place of roughly 4,000 civilians. But Bastogne's strategic importance was immense. 7 major roads converged there like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement throughout the entire Ardennes region. German commanders understood they had to seize Bastogne quickly. Without it, their armored columns could not be resupplied or reinforced efficiently, and the entire offensive could stall. So as German panzers swept past to the north and south, infantry and supporting armor were tasked with capturing the town at once. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower grasped Bastogne's importance immediately. On December 17th, a day after the offensive began, he ordered the 101st Airborne Division to move to Bastogne without delay. The Screaming Eagles, as they were known, were resting near Reims, France, after 2 brutal months of fighting during Operation Market Garden in Holland. The men had been looking forward to rest, hot meals, and perhaps a pass to Paris. Instead, they were roused in the middle of the night, loaded into trucks, and driven through snow and ice toward Belgium. Many lacked proper winter gear. They wore the same uniforms they had jumped in during the summer. Some had no overcoats. Few had adequate cold-weather boots. The 101st Airborne arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German troops completed the encirclement. Also stationed there were Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various artillery and support units. In all, about 14,000 American soldiers found themselves defending Bastogne against a German force of over 70,000, supported by tanks and heavy guns. Command of the U.S. garrison fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. At 46, McAuliffe was a career artillery officer, known for his steady composure under pressure. He had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day and fought through the bloody hedgerows of France. His men had absolute faith in him. McAuliffe's position was desperate from the moment the Germans sealed the ring around Bastogne on December 21st. His 14,000 thalers. Men faced an enemy force 5 times their size. The weather had turned bitterly cold, with temperatures plunging well below freezing. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, preventing supply drops or air support. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food stocks were dangerously low, medical supplies were nearly gone, and wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations with little more than cognac to dull their agony. Ammunition was strictly rationed. Artillerymen limited to 10 rounds per gun per day. Every shot had to count, because there would be no replacements. The soldiers dug into the frozen earth, building foxholes and defenses around the town's edge. German artillery pounded them incessantly. Panzer units probed their lines, searching for weakness. Machine gun fire swept the open fields. Men died in their holes, from shrapnel, bullets, and the merciless cold. The town's Belgian civilians suffered alongside the American soldiers. Families huddled in cellars as artillery shells demolished their homes. Belgian nurses, housewives, and priests worked in the makeshift hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers despite the constant danger. When medical supplies ran out, they offered what comfort they could. But there was precious little of that to go around. General McAuliffe established his headquarters in a cellar on the northern edge of Bastogne. From this cramped, dimly lit room, he coordinated the defense of the entire perimeter. Reports came in constantly of German attacks, casualties mounting, ammunition running low. McAuliffe remained calm, moving units to threatened sectors, distributing the dwindling ammunition where it was needed most. His primary advantage was interior lines. Because the Americans held a compact perimeter, they could shift forces quickly from one threatened sector to another. German attacks came in sequence rather than simultaneously, allowing American defenders to concentrate their limited resources wherever the Germans struck hardest. On December 22nd, the weather remained the German surrender ultimatum terrible. Fog blanketed the landscape. Snow fell intermittently. Allied aircraft remained grounded, unable to drop supplies or attack German positions. The men of the 100 were entering their third day of encirclement, and everyone knew supplies couldn't last much longer. That morning, German artillery intensified. Shells crashed into Bastogne with greater frequency than before. The bombardment seemed to signal that a major assault was imminent. American soldiers checked their weapons, counted their remaining ammunition, and waited for the attack they knew was coming. But the attack didn't come. Instead, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, American soldiers watching the southern perimeter saw 4 German soldiers emerge from the tree carrying a large white flag. Private Leo Palmer and Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson were among the first to spot them. The German delegation consisted of 2 officers, Major Wagner and Lieutenant Hanker, accompanied by 2 enlisted men. Major Wagner carried a briefcase containing a formal surrender ultimatum. The Germans approached the American lines carefully, making clear their peaceful intentions with the white flag held high above their heads. After making contact with forward American positions, the German officers were blindfolded and escorted to a company command post. The enlisted men who had accompanied them remained under guard at the perimeter. Major Ragnar explained through an interpreter that he carried an urgent message that must be delivered to the American commander. Word of the German delegation spread rapidly through American lines. Soldiers began speculating wildly about what the message might contain. Many genuinely believed the Germans were surrendering. It seemed logical. The Americans had held for 3 days against overwhelming odds. Perhaps the Germans had finally realized that taking Bastogne would cost more than it was worth. The German officers were taken to the regimental headquarters of the 327th Glider Infantry. There, Lieutenant Colonel Nedmore read the surrender ultimatum. The document was typed in English on official German military stationery. Its tone was formal but carried an underlying threat. The message began by acknowledging the military situation. It noted that American forces were completely surrounded and cut off from reinforcements. German armored units had crossed the Our River, taken March, and reached St. Kubert. Libram was in German hands. There was, the message stated, only one way to save the encircled American troops from total annihilation: honorable surrender. The ultimatum gave the Americans 2 hours to consider. If they refused, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions would immediately bombard Bastogne. The message concluded by noting that serious civilian casualties would result from this bombardment, and such losses would not correspond with well-known American humanity. It was psychological warfare wrapped in a surrender demand. The Germans were trying to place the moral burden for civilian casualties on the Americans, while simultaneously threatening military annihilation. Accept defeat and save civilian lives, or fight and bear responsibility for innocent deaths. Colonel Moore immediately telephoned General McAuliffe's headquarters to report the surrender ultimatum. Officers began making frantic calls up the chain of command. The German message created confusion and uncertainty. Some junior officers wondered if perhaps surrender was the sensible option given their desperate situation. General McAuliffe was not at his headquarters when the initial call came through. He had gone forward to visit McAuliffe's one-word reply-on of the units on the perimeter, encouraging his men and assessing their condition firsthand. When he returned to his basement command post, his staff informed him about the German surrender ultimatum. According to multiple accounts from officers present, McAuliffe's initial reaction was simple and direct. When told that the Germans were demanding his surrender, he responded with a single word: nuts. Then he turned his attention to other pressing matters such as artillery ammunition, distribution, and defensive positioning. His staff, however, reminded him that the German officers were waiting for an official written reply. The surrender ultimatum had been a formal document. Military protocol required a formal response. McAuliffe sat down with a pencil and paper to compose his answer. He thought for several minutes about what to say. How do you respond to an enemy demanding your surrender when you have no intention whatsoever of complying? McAuliffe turned to his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, and said, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." Key. Kinnard immediately replied, "What you said initially would be hard to beat." General McAuliffe looked puzzled. He didn't recall saying anything particularly noteworthy. Card reminded him, "Sir, you said nuts." The other officers in the command post broke into applause and laughter. It was perfect. Short, defiant, unmistakably American. McAuliffe wrote it down. The complete official reply to the German surrender ultimatum consisted of 4 words. To the German commander, "Nuts," the American commander. He handed it to his staff and said, "Have it typed up." A clear typed the message on official stationery, and it was given to Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry, to deliver personally to the waiting German officers. Harper returned to where Major Wagner and Lieutenant Hanker waited, still blindfolded. He informed them that he had the American commander reply. The Germans asked if it was written or verbal. Harper said it was written and handed them the typed message. The blindfolds were removed so they could read it. Major Wagner and Lieutenant Hanke stared at the paper in confusion. They understood English reasonably well, but nuts was American slang that made no sense in translation. They asked Harper to explain. What did this word mean? Was it affirmative or negative? Colonel Harper's explanation was blunt and unambiguous. "If you don't understand what nuts means," he said in plain English, "it's the same as go to hell. And I will tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officers saluted stiffly. As they turned to leave, Lieutenant Hanker made one final comment. "We will kill many Americans. This is war." Harper nodded. The German confusion and response. "That is correct. This is war." The German officers were blindfolded again and escorted back to their own lines. When Major Wagner delivered the American response to his superiors, it created confusion at German headquarters. The commanding general had expected either acceptance or a desperate counterposal, perhaps pleading for better surrender terms. Instead, he received a one-word reply that was simultaneously humorous and contemptuous. General Heinrich Freier von Lutwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, besieging Bastogne, later claimed he had not authorized the surrender demand. He said it came from the Panzer Division without his approval. Other German commanders also distanced themselves from the ultimatum. Whether this was true or simply an attempt to avoid association with a failed psychological warfare operation remains unclear. What is certain is that the German response to McAuliffe's refusal was immediate and brutal. As promised, German artillery and aircraft began a sustained bombardment of Bastogne. On the night of December 22nd, the Luftwaffe conducted a 4-night bombing campaign against the town. High-explosive bombs crashed into buildings, destroying homes and creating rubble-filled streets. One bomb struck an aid station, killing 21 wounded soldiers and medical personnel. The explosion tore through the makeshift hospital, collapsing walls and burying men under debris. Belgian nurses and American medics dug frantically through the wreckage, searching for survivors. The attack demonstrated that German threats about civilian casualties had not been empty. On December 23rd, the weather clears. Supplies arrive, weather finally cleared. For the first time in days, Allied aircraft could fly. The skies above Bastogne filled with C-47 transport planes, their engines droning as they approached at low altitude to drop supplies. Parachutes blossomed in the sky, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the surrounded defenders. German anti-aircraft batteries fired at the supply planes, shooting several down. Some supply drops fell outside the American perimeter, landing in German-held territory. Butenhoff reached the defenders to make a critical difference. Ammunition stocks were replenished. Medical personnel received plasma and bandages. The men got their first hot food in days. Allied fighter bombers also arrived, attacking German positions around Bastogne. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed German infantry and tanks, dropping bombs and firing rockets. The air support was devastating. German units that had been massing for attacks were torn apart by aerial bombardment. The balance of firepower, which had favored the Germans, while the weather kept Allied planes grounded, suddenly shifted. But the most important development on December 23rd was happening 60 mi to the south. Lieutenant General George S. Pattons' Third Army, which had been fighting in a completely different sector, was executing one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in history. Patton was turning his entire army 90 degrees and driving north toward Bastogne. When Eisenhower called his commanders together on December 19th to plan the Allied response to the German offensive, Patton had shocked everyone by announcing he could have 3 divisions attacking north toward Bastogne within 48 hours. Other commanders thought it was impossible. You couldn't turn an entire army that quickly. The logistics alone would be nightmarish, but Patton had anticipated the need. He'd already prepared contingency plans for exactly this scenario. His staff had worked out the routes, fuel requirements, and timing. When Eisenhower gave the order, Patton's Third Army began one of the fastest and most complex redeployments in military history. Over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles turned north and began fighting their way toward the surrounded town. Inside Bastogne, the defenders knew relief was coming, but didn't know if it would arrive in time. German attacks intensified on December 24th and 25th. On Christmas Eve, 18 German tanks, carrying a battalion of infantry pierced Christmas Eve, breakthrough attempt the American defensive line on the western perimeter. The tanks advanced as far as the small village of Hemrul, less than a mile from McAuliffe's headquarters. American defenders fought desperately to contain the breakthrough. Tank destroyers moved to block the German advance. Infantry units that had been in reserve rushed forward to plug the gap. In vicious close-quarters combat, American soldiers destroyed the German tanks and drove back the infantry. 92 German soldiers were captured. The penetration was sealed and the line held. That evening on Christmas Eve, General McAuliffe composed a message to his troops. He wanted them to understand the significance of what they were accomplishing. His words were both realistic about their situation and inspiring about their achievement. McAuliffe acknowledged that Christmas in Bastogne was hardly merry. They were fighting. It was cold. They weren't home. But he asked his men to consider what they had accomplished. They had stopped cold everything the Germans had thrown at them. By holding Bastogne, they were ensuring the success of all Allied armies. They were giving their country and their loved ones a worthy Christmas present. Privately on the telephone to his superior, General Troy Middleton, McAuliffe was less inspirational. "The finest Christmas present the 101st could get," he said grimly. "Would be a relief tomorrow." Middleton's response was equally somber. "I know, boy. I know. Christmas Day brought more German attacks." The defenders of Bastogne were exhausted, running on adrenaline and willpower. Casualties continued mounting. Every man lost weakened the defensive perimeter. Everyone wondered how much longer they could hold. Then on December 26th at approximately 4:45 in the afternoon, lead elements of the Pattons Relief Column breaks through 4th Armored Division from Patton's Third Army, broke through German lines south of Bastogne, and made contact with the 101st Airborne. The siege was lifted after 6 days of being completely surrounded. The defenders of Bastogne were relieved. When the first Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored rolled into Bastogne, the men of the 101st lined the streets. They were gaunt, exhausted, many wounded. Their uniforms were torn and filthy, but they were standing. They had refused to surrender, and they had won. General McAuliffe met the commander of the relief column with characteristic understatements. "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you," he said, shaking hands with a tank officer who had fought his way through German lines to reach Bastogne. The officer replied, "We're damn glad to be here, General W." The battle for Bastogne was not over. German forces would continue attacking the town for weeks. The 101st Airborne remained in the line until mid-January, fighting off repeated German assaults. But the critical moment had passed. Bastogne had held. Hitler's offensive had been stopped. The Bulge would be gradually pushed back until the front was restored. The human cost had been staggering. Of the 14,000 American soldiers who defended Bastogne, casualties were approximately 40%. Nearly 2,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The town itself was largely destroyed, reduced to rubble by weeks of bombardment. Belgian civilians had suffered terribly, caught between two armies fighting for control of their home. For the German army, the failure to take Bastogne was catastrophic. The town's resistance threw off the entire timetable for the offensive. German armored spearheads, unable to use Bastogne's roads for supply, ran out of fuel and ammunition. The advance stalled, then collapsed. Hitler had gambled everything on this offensive, and it failed largely because one small town refused to surrender. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until late January. 1945, the legacy of one word. It became the largest battle ever, fought by the United States Army with more than 600,000 American troops participating. Total American casualties exceeded 80,000, including 19,000 killed. It was the bloodiest battle in American military history. But when people remember the Battle of the Bulge, they remember Bastogne. They remember 14,000 American soldiers surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, and running out of supplies who refused to surrender. And they remember one word: nuts. That single word captured something essential about the American fighting spirit. It wasn't a carefully crafted military response. It was spontaneous, defiant, and unmistakably American. It said in the bluntest possible terms that surrender was not an option, that the defenders of Bastogne would fight regardless of the odds, regardless of the cost. General McAuliffe's reply spread through the American military like wildfire. Soldiers repeated it to each other with pride and amusement. Here was a general who talked like a regular soldier, who responded to pompous German surrender demands with American slang. The story appeared in newspapers across the United States. McAuliffe became a national hero. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had initially been skeptical of American fighting quality, was deeply impressed by the defense of Bastogne. He later stated that the Battle of the Bulge was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Charles D. Craw, General McAuliffe, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the siege. The 101st Airborne Division received a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that can be awarded to a military unit. Bastogne became forever associated with the Screaming Eagles, their finest hour in a history filled with extraordinary achievements. The town of Bastogne erected monuments to its American defenders. Every year on December 22nd, ceremonies commemorate the siege and honor those who fought. A museum in the town preserves artifacts from the battle, including a replica of the nuts, like his message. The word itself entered American military slang as an expression of defiance. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of Bastogne was what it demonstrated about leadership under impossible circumstances. General McAuliffe faced a situation where surrender might have been militarily justifiable. His force was outnumbered, surrounded, and running out of supplies. He bore responsibility, not just for his soldiers, but for thousands of Belgian civilians who would suffer if the battle continued. The German surrender ultimatum was designed to exploit exactly this moral dilemma: accept defeat and end the suffering, or fight and be responsible for civilian deaths. It was psychological warfare aimed at breaking the American commander's will. McAuliffe's response showed that moral courage sometimes means accepting difficult consequences in pursuit of a larger objective. He understood that Bastogne was strategically vital. If it fell, Hitler's offensive might succeed. The stakes extended far beyond his 14,000 soldiers and one Belgian town. surrendering Bastogne could prolong the entire war. His soldiers understood this, too. When McAuliffe's Christmas Eve message was read to the troops, explaining why they were fighting and what they were accomplishing, the men responded with renewed determination. They weren't just holding ground for the sake of stubbornness. They were ensuring Allied victory. Their sacrifice had meaning. The story of Bastogne reminds us that military courage isn't always about attacking or advancing. Sometimes it's about standing firm when every rational, why Bastogne mattered calculation suggests retreat. It's about refusing to accept defeat even when surrounded by overwhelming force. It's about making the hard choice to continue fighting when surrender would be easier. In late January 1945, after the 101st Airborne was finally pulled from the front lines, General McAuliffe wrote a letter to the families of soldiers who had died defending Bastogne. His words reflected the weight of command, the burden of sending men to their deaths in pursuit of victory. He told them that their sons, husbands, and fathers had died accomplishing something truly significant. They had stopped the last German offensive of the war. They had demonstrated American fighting spirit to the world. Their sacrifice had hastened the end of the war and saved countless other lives. He hoped this knowledge might provide some small comfort in their grief. It was inadequate, as all such letters are. Words cannot compensate for loss. But McAuliffe's letter was honest about what had been asked of these men and what they had accomplished. They had been given an impossible task: hold Bastogne against overwhelming odds with insufficient supplies. And they had done it. General Anthony McAuliffe survived the war and remained in the Army, eventually rising to the rank of 4-star general. He commanded the U.S. Army in Europe during the early years of the Cold War. But for the rest of his life, he was known as the general who said nuts at Bastogne. It became his permanent legacy, the single moment that defined his career. He handled this fame with characteristic modesty. When asked about the famous reply, McAuliffe would often point out that the real heroes were the soldiers in the foxholes who actually did the fighting. He had just told the Germans what every American defender was already thinking. The word was his, but the defiant spirit it expressed belonged to all of them. The soldiers who fought at Bastogne carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. They had been part of something remarkable, a moment when ordinary Americans achieved the extraordinary through sheer resolve and an unwillingness to surrender. Bastogne veterans formed associations, held gatherings, and revisited the town to honor their fallen brothers in arms. Decades later, when asked what they recalled most about Bastogne, veterans almost always mentioned the cold first. The bone-chilling cold that never faded, that made every movement torment, that claimed lives as surely as German bullets. They remembered the hunger, the fatigue, the constant dread. They recalled comrades who perished in foxholes beside them. But they also remembered the pride. They had been told they were surrounded, and someone had joked, "They've got us surrounded, the poor devils." That grim humor sustained them. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and in grave peril. But they never doubted they would endure. Surrender was never seriously contemplated, despite the dire conditions. This unwavering resolve, this refusal to yield regardless of the odds, became the lasting legacy of Bastogne. It embodied something essential about the American fighting spirit, an unwillingness to quit even in the face of overwhelming hardship. The German officers who encircled Bastogne were seasoned professionals who had conquered much of Europe. They couldn't comprehend why the Americans refused to give in when the situation appeared hopeless. The logical decision, from a purely tactical viewpoint, was to accept terms and preserve lives. But the Americans at Bastogne weren't guided by mere tactics. They were fighting for something far greater than themselves. They understood that their stand at that remote Belgian crossroads might decide whether Hitler's final gamble succeeded or collapsed. They chose to fight, not because victory seemed certain, but because the alternative was intolerable. Today, the town of Bastogne stands as a living tribute to that decision. The Mardassen Memorial, a star-shaped monument on a hill outside the town, bears the names of American units that fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Inside, inscriptions in English, French, Dutch, and Flemish express gratitude to the American soldiers who liberated Belgium. The Bastogne War Museum recounts the siege through artifacts, documents, and personal testimonies. Visitors can view the original typed "Nuts" message preserved behind glass. They can walk through reconstructions of the foxholes where the Americans fought and read the letters soldiers sent home, sometimes written just days before they were killed. Every December, when snow blankets the Ardennes forest and temperatures plunge below freezing, it's easy to imagine what those soldiers endured. The landscape remains largely unchanged. The roads they defended still meet at Bastogne. The woods where they fought remain dark and dense. The cold still bites as fiercely as it did in December 1944. The story of Bastogne endures because it reflects courage at its purest. Not courage in a single dramatic moment, but the sustained bravery required to hold your ground day after day while surrounded, starving, and running out of hope. It's the courage to keep resisting when surrender would be far easier. General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word response captured that spirit flawlessly. Nuts wasn't polished or formal. It was blunt, fearless, and unmistakable. It told the Germans the Americans would fight to the last man, rather than capitulate. And it told every soldier in Bastogne that their commander shared their determination to hold at any cost. Nearly 8 decades later, Bastogne remains a symbol of American military valor. When soldiers today study the battle, they learn lessons about leadership under impossible pressure, the importance of holding vital ground, and the power of defiance. The lessons of Bastogne continue to influence American military doctrine and inspire new generations of warriors. The 14,000 galars, Americans who defended Bastogne in December 1944 didn't realize they were shaping history. They were cold, hungry, and terrified, simply fulfilling their duty as they understood it, defending the ground they'd been told to hold. Many died without ever knowing their stand would be remembered as one of the greatest feats in American military history. But their commander gave them something that sustained them through 6 brutal days, the knowledge that their sacrifice mattered. When General McAuliffe told the Germans, "Nuts," he was speaking as much to his own men as to the enemy, assuring them that he believed in them, that he would not abandon them, that they would stand together no matter the cost. That message resonated far beyond Bastogne. It told every American soldier in Europe that their army would not yield, that it would fight until victory was secured. It told the American people back home that their sons and brothers were triumphing against Hitler's best. And it told the German High Command that the U.S. Army they had once dismissed as soft and inexperienced would fight with unbreakable tenacity. The siege of Bastogne ended 80 years ago, yet its legacy lives on. The story is taught at military academies worldwide as a lesson in defensive warfare and leadership under fire. The word "nuts" has entered the American military vocabulary as shorthand for unyielding defiance. And every December 22nd, in that small Belgian town, ceremonies honor those who refuse to give up when surrounded by overwhelming force. In the end, Bastogne was about more than strategy or tactics. It was about the human spirit, about the ability of ordinary individuals to achieve the extraordinary when tested by crisis. The soldiers who defended that town weren't superhuman. They were cold, frightened young men far from home, but they stood firm. And in doing so, they became legends. They became legends.